برحب مع حضراتكم بالسيدة تيريزا موريرا رئيس فرع المنافسة وسياسات المستهلك بمؤتمر الأمم المتحدة للتجارة والتنمية. Ms. Theresa, it's an honor to have you on المحور TV.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here and speak to you.
Let me first ask you, UNCTAD ranked Egypt as the first destination for investment in Africa. What were the factors leading to such announcement?
Well, UNCTAD is very strong on a number of issues related broadly to trade and development, but investment being so relevant, so connected with international trade, of course, has been one of our strongest areas of analysis. And, we assess countries in order to advise countries. So we do policy advice. We usually do our assessments at the request and in collaboration with the countries, and our focus is to assist developing countries. So in the case of Egypt, I think that since the 90s, clearly Egypt has undergone very important changes, has introduced important reforms, and it has been able to, as we heard today in the panel, to have very impressive economic growth rates, and at the same time to adopt a number of key measures to open markets, to further attract foreign direct investment, to promote further efficiency concerns in a very balanced manner. Of course, there are some measures that still remain to be fully implemented, while at the same time, to my knowledge, Egypt's international trade measures also need to be a little bit eased out in order for investors and exports to arrive. But I believe that your country has had a very impressive route in the last years. And even nowadays, after the impact of the pandemic outbreak, which of course worsened conditions for populations, for businesses, mostly in developing countries, and also within countries, worsen standards of living, unfortunately, and followed by this cascading crisis brought about by the environmental degradation, by geopolitical tensions. All of this is having, of course, an impact that is quite negative all over the world, but clearly your country in particular, for instance, in what regards food markets and agriculture, and now since last fall, these impacts in the Red Sea and so close to home, all of this, of course, reflects in the economy. And I think it's very positive that the government continues committed to implement reforms like the ones that we were discussing here today. So I think UNCTAD's assessments are also an encouragement, but of course we remain available to assist the country and the government to the best of our capacities.
You have mentioned the impressive growth rate, economic growth rate in Egypt in the previous years. How were these numbers affected by the unexpected events starting from the pandemic, then the Russian-Ukrainian war, and another unfortunate events in the Middle East?
I think the growth rate probably would have been more impressive had this not occurred, because clearly there have been a number of structural reforms being implemented. And as we know, even if governments are committed to open up markets, to liberalize, to be more efficient, all of this takes time because laws need to be approved, policies need to be being implemented, and you have to have the private sector on board. You have to have good coordination within the ministries and other departmental bodies. So it is always a process, a reform commitment. Now, I think that, for instance, high food prices that came about after the war in Ukraine started, because both Ukraine and the Russian Federation are huge producers of cereals and fertilizers. So an impact not just on the food staples, but also in something so obvious as bread, so for agricultures. And we know that there was some unrest and there was quite a lot of concern in the society and in the market. These, of course, had a very negative impact. I think what we saw across the world, but mostly in the African continent, was that African countries were very, very seriously hit by the trade negative impact of the start of the war in Ukraine. And at the same time, because UNCTAD also follows issues such as maritime transportation, we have a very interesting report, which is the review of maritime transportation. And we assessed some months ago the impact of the conflicts in the Middle East in the price of freight, in the price of insurance. So this means to say that imports for countries became also more expensive because the maritime routes were affected and the import goods became more expensive. So it is a confluence. That's why I talked about cascading crisis, because the world seems to be facing different crises in numerous fronts. And unfortunately, it's usually the less developed countries that suffer the most.
I'm glad you mentioned the role of private sector, because Egypt in the past few months was able to attract major deals. How do you view these facts in Egypt recently?
Well, the Egyptian economy is very big, and I think Egypt has had a leading role even in the region because it has been out of the forefront, for instance, at all these competition and competitive markets related reforms, this competitive neutrality commitment by the government, the Egyptian Competition Authority, a very strong record. You saw the number of decisions and recommendations. So really being out there, asserting themselves in the market. But I think, of course, in a country as big as Egypt, you will always have, like most countries, whatever their size, small businesses, family type of businesses that often are not necessarily, let's say, in the same position as other, as far as opportunities are concerned. So they may be lagging behind, and that, of course, affects a part of the population and also a part of the economic activities. You have big investments, but as we also heard today, there is still a considerable number of state-owned companies or state-owned participations in companies. And usually, if the state is involved in commercial activities, it needs really to improve a lot of procedures in order to be efficient. And that also can mean that some services, some goods may be provided at a higher cost than they should. So there is still work to be done. I thought it was very interesting that the conference really invited high-level representatives of different industries and business associations. You cannot modernize a country without working together with all. So private sector always needs to be mobilized in a way. We talked a lot also about awareness raising. This is very important. But when we talk about awareness raising, we should not only focus on the big companies or the foreign direct investors. You need to convey this message and raise awareness of the smallest one. And, of course, consider also the informal economy, because in most developing countries, informal economy also represents an important part of the economy and of the population. And there's also a work to be done. So you cannot just focus on investors. I think you understand what I'm saying. But it is a process. And I think the most recent signs and the data are quite positive regarding Egypt's economic performance.
Let me also ask you about the way UNCTAD sees the current situation in the Middle East and, of course, the world, in light of increasing conflicts, in light of the turmoil in the whole world, as we see nowadays. What are your priorities? Where are you focused geographically, at least?
Well, in general, so UNCTAD actually celebrates this week 60 years of existence. It was created to give voice to developing countries. So our mandate is related to all areas relevant for international trade and development, and these comprise finance, because financing for development is so essential. Financing, investment that we already talked about, also technology, logistics, and of course, my areas, competition and consumer policies. But the focus of UNCTAD is always to do policy advice and to assist developing countries that request our assistance implementing reforms, rethinking legislative and regulatory frameworks, and enhancing the capacities of the governments, public officials, and also of relevant stakeholders. For instance, we do a lot of capacity building to young entrepreneurs, to women entrepreneurs, depending, of course, on the region. Now, our priority has traditionally been Africa, because it's the continent where there are more less developed countries and where levels of poverty and other serious indicators are of concern.
And